This video contains audio content only. There are no visual elements or images accompanying the audio. If you're expecting to see video footage, please note that this is an intentional audio-only presentation. We recommend listening to this content rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding and enjoy the audio. Welcome to an exploration of one of humanity's most complex and fascinating intersections, the relationship between religion and nudity. I'm your host, and today we're diving deep into a topic that has shaped civilizations, sparked controversies, and continues to influence modern debates about spirituality, modesty, and human nature. From the moment Adam and Eve realized they were naked in the Garden of Eden to contemporary religious movements embracing nudity as a spiritual practice, the unclothed human form has played a pivotal role in religious thought and practice across cultures and throughout history. This relationship is far more nuanced and surprising than most people realize. Think about it. How did we move from a world where early Christians were baptized completely naked as a symbol of spiritual rebirth to one where many modern religious institutions strictly regulate even the most minor exposure of skin? Why do some religious movements celebrate nudity as a path to divine connection while others view it as a source of shame and sin? These questions touch on fundamental aspects of human experience, our relationship with our bodies, our search for spiritual meaning, and our endless negotiation between natural states and social conventions. Today's journey will take us through ancient temples and modern churches, from ascetic monasteries to naturist communities, examining how different faiths have interpreted and reinterpreted the significance of human nudity. We'll explore fascinating historical episodes you've likely never heard about, like the naked protests of 17th-century Quakers who went naked as a sign to criticize church corruption, or the complex theological debates that arose when Christian missionaries encountered cultures with very different attitudes toward nudity. What makes this topic particularly relevant today is how it intersects with contemporary debates about modesty, freedom of expression, and religious liberty. As our society grapples with questions about dress codes, body shame, and religious accommodation, understanding the historical and theological context of these issues becomes increasingly important. We'll examine how different religions have used nudity both as a symbol of spiritual purity and as a mark of shame, how religious art has navigated the complexities of depicting the nude form, and how modern religious movements are reinterpreting ancient attitudes toward nudity in surprising ways. We'll also look at how gender plays a crucial role in religious attitudes toward nudity, often leading to dramatically different standards and expectations for men and women. This exploration isn't just about historical curiosity, it's about understanding the deep connections between our physical and spiritual selves, and how different religious traditions have tried to make sense of this relationship. Whether you're a student of religion, interested in cultural history, or simply curious about how different societies approach these fundamental human questions, you'll find something fascinating in today's discussion. So join me as we embark on this journey through the complex and often surprising relationship between religion and nudity. From ancient ritual practices to modern controversies, from artistic expression to spiritual liberation movements, we'll explore how this fundamental aspect of human existence has been understood, regulated, celebrated, and transformed by religious thought and practice throughout history. 1. The sacred and the scandalous. The story of nakedness in religion begins with what seems like an irreconcilable contradiction. In the Abrahamic faiths, we see humanity's original state as one of pure, unashamed nakedness in Eden, yet the realization of nakedness becomes the first sign of humanity's fall from grace. This paradox has shaped religious attitudes toward the human body for millennia and continues to influence modern spiritual thought in surprising ways. Consider the profound implications of the Genesis narrative. Adam and Eve, created in God's image, walked naked and unashamed in paradise. Their nakedness wasn't just incidental, it was a defining feature of their perfect state. As the medieval theologian Hugh of St. Victor wrote, in paradise, man's body was naked, but his soul was clothed with the radiance of divine grace. This suggests that nakedness, in its purest form, represented humanity's closest connection to the divine. Yet the same text tells us that the awareness of nakedness became the first consequence of eating from the tree of knowledge. This transformation, from unashamed nakedness to shameful awareness, marks a fundamental shift in human consciousness. But here's where it gets interesting. The shame wasn't inherent in the nakedness itself, but in the new way of perceiving it. This distinction has led to centuries of theological debate and widely varying religious practices. The early Christian church took this paradox seriously, often in ways that might surprise modern believers. In the first several centuries of Christianity, baptism was performed with the candidate completely naked, regardless of age or gender. This wasn't just a practical matter, it was deeply symbolic. The nakedness of baptism represented a return to humanity's original state of grace, a new birth echoing humanity's first creation. Saint Cyril of Jerusalem, writing in the 4th century, explicitly connected baptismal nudity to Eden, telling his catechumens they were made naked, imitating Christ naked on the cross, who by his nakedness spoiled principalities and powers. This practice continued for centuries, with elaborate protocols developing to maintain modesty while preserving the symbolic power of ritual nudity. Churches built special baptistries with separate sections for men and women, and deaconesses were appointed to assist with female baptisms. The fact that the early church went to such lengths to preserve nude baptism, despite practical challenges and potential scandal, shows how important this symbol of return to primal innocence was to early Christian theology. The paradox extends beyond Christianity. In Hinduism, we find naked ascetics revered as holy men alongside strict codes of modest dress. The Digambara Jain monks reject all clothing as part of their vow of complete renunciation, while their lay followers observe careful modes of dress. These seemingly contradictory approaches often exist within the same tradition, pointing to a deeper understanding that nakedness can signify both the heights of spiritual achievement and the depths of worldly attachment, depending on its context and intention. Perhaps most fascinating is how this paradox plays out in religious art. The same medieval church that insisted on modest dress created sculptures and paintings depicting Christ and the saints naked or nearly so. The naked Christ child, the nearly nude crucified Jesus, and the bare-breasted Virgin Mary were common in religious art, yet similar depictions in a secular context would have been considered scandalous. This suggests a sophisticated understanding that nakedness could simultaneously be sacred and profane, depending on its context and symbolic meaning. This paradox continues to influence modern religious movements in unexpected ways. Christian naturist groups, for example, argue that body shame is a consequence of the fall, not part of God's original plan, and that accepting the naked body can be part of spiritual healing. Meanwhile, other religious groups see modest dress as essential to spiritual purity, interpreting the same texts to support very different conclusions. The historical evidence suggests that this apparent contradiction isn't really a contradiction at all, but rather points to a deeper truth about human nature and spirituality. Nakedness, like many physical realities, serves as a powerful symbol that can carry multiple, even seemingly opposite meanings. It can represent both humanity's highest and lowest states, our closest connection to the divine and our furthest fall from grace. Understanding this paradox helps us make sense of why religious attitudes toward nudity have been so complex and varied throughout history. It's not simply a matter of some religions being pro-nudity and others anti-nudity. Rather, most religious traditions contain within themselves multiple ways of understanding and interpreting the significance of the naked human form, leading to rich and sometimes contradictory practices and beliefs. The way religious texts address nudity reveals fascinating insights into how different faiths have grappled with the human body's spiritual significance. What's particularly intriguing is how the same texts have been interpreted in radically different ways throughout history, leading to diverse and sometimes contradictory practices. In Judaism, the concept of urva, nakedness or sexual impropriety, has generated volumes of rabbinical discussion. The Torah's approach to nudity is more nuanced than many realize. While it contains prohibitions against uncovering nakedness, these references often serve as euphemisms for sexual relationships rather than literal nudity. The Jewish requirement for modest dress, known as tzniut, actually derives more from rabbinical interpretations than direct biblical commands. This has led to varying standards across different Jewish communities, from the strict covering requirements of Haredi communities to more relaxed interpretations in Reform Judaism. A fascinating example of this complexity appears in the Talmudic discussions of the ritual bath, mikveh. Jewish law requires complete nudity for ritual immersion. Not even a bandage or single thread can separate the person from the water. This creates an interesting tension. The same tradition that emphasizes modest dress also requires periodic ritual nudity. Rabbinical authorities resolved this by developing elaborate protocols for maintaining privacy during immersion while preserving the requirement for complete nudity. Islamic texts present their own intriguing treatment of nudity through the concept of aura, the parts of the body that must be covered. What many people don't know is that the Quran itself contains relatively few direct prescriptions about covering the body. Most detailed regulations come from hadith and later interpretations. The extent of aura varies significantly depending on context. What must be covered during prayer differs from what must be covered in public, which differs again from what must be covered in private or among family members. A particularly interesting case study comes from the Islamic Golden Age, when public bathhouses, hammams, were common throughout the Muslim world. Religious authorities had to reconcile the practical need for bathing with concerns about modesty, leading to detailed regulations about who could see whom in what state of undress. Some scholars permitted nudity in same-sex bathhouses, while others insisted on covering with a cloth. This demonstrates how religious principles often adapted to social realities while maintaining their essential character. The Christian New Testament contains surprisingly few direct references to nudity as a moral issue. When nakedness is mentioned, it's often in the context of poverty or vulnerability rather than shame. The famous passage where Peter swims naked to meet Jesus, John chapter 21 verse 7, is particularly telling. It's mentioned matter-of-factly, without moral judgment. Yet Christianity has developed some of the strictest attitudes toward nudity among world religions. This evolution reveals something crucial about how religious attitudes develop. They're often shaped more by cultural interpretation and historical circumstances than by direct textual commands. The early Christian Church, for instance, had to navigate between Roman cultural acceptance of nudity and Jewish emphasis on modesty. This led to complex theological discussions about the body, particularly regarding practices like nude baptism. Hindu texts present perhaps the most varied approach to nudity among major religions. The same tradition that produced the explicitly erotic temple carvings of Khajuraho also gave rise to ascetic traditions of complete nudity. The Upanishads speak of sky-clad Digambara sages who renounced all worldly attachments, including clothing. Yet Hindu texts also emphasize the importance of appropriate dress according to one's role and status in society. A particularly fascinating example comes from the Tantric traditions, where ritual nudity could serve as a path to spiritual liberation. The famous skull-bearing Kapalika ascetics deliberately transgressed conventional moral boundaries, including nudity taboos, as part of their spiritual practice. This highlights how some religious traditions have used nudity not just as a natural state to be regulated, but as a powerful tool for spiritual transformation. Buddhist texts approach nudity primarily through the lens of attachment and desire. The Buddha reportedly rejected both extreme asceticism, including nudity, and sensual indulgence, advocating a middle path. However, this didn't prevent the development of traditions like the Korean practice of heat-enduring meditation, where monks would sit naked in the snow to demonstrate their transcendence of bodily concerns. What's particularly striking across all these traditions is how practical considerations often intersect with spiritual principles. Religious texts might set forth ideal standards, but these frequently had to be adapted to real-world situations. This led to the development of complex systems of exceptions and special cases, naked ritual baths in Judaism, nude baptism in early Christianity, communal bathing in Islam, and various ascetic practices in Eastern religions. The fascinating disconnect between official religious teachings about nudity and how believers actually navigate these requirements in daily life reveals much about human nature and religious adaptation. This gap between theory and practice has created some of history's most interesting religious innovations and compromises. Consider the remarkable case of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, where for centuries, the ancient tradition of nude baptism collided with practical modesty concerns. Their solution was ingenious. They developed a special baptismal garment called a kemi, which became transparent when wet, symbolically preserving the tradition of naked baptism while maintaining physical modesty. This compromise perfectly illustrates how religious communities often find creative ways to honor both spiritual ideals and practical concerns. The Catholic Church's handling of artistic nudity presents another compelling example of this theoretical-practical divide. While church teachings emphasized modesty in dress and behavior, the Vatican itself houses one of the world's largest collections of nude art. The famous fig leaf campaign of the 16th century, where Pope Pius IV ordered genitalia in sacred art to be covered, shows the complex negotiation between artistic tradition and religious propriety. What many don't know is that several popes actually opposed these modifications, arguing that the human form, created in God's image, shouldn't be censored in sacred art. In contemporary Orthodox Jewish communities, we find fascinating examples of how ancient laws about modesty are adapted to modern life. The concept of mechitza, separation between men and women, has led to elaborate architectural solutions in swimming pools and beaches. Some communities have developed special swimwear that meets religious requirements while allowing women to participate in water activities. There's even a growing industry of kosher beaches with designated times for separate male and female swimming. The case of Japanese Buddhist temples provides another interesting example. Many temples historically contained sento, public baths, where communal nudity was common, despite Buddhism's general emphasis on modesty. This apparent contradiction was resolved by treating the bathhouse as a special ritual space where normal rules of modesty were suspended. Even today, many Japanese people who are otherwise modest have no issue with communal bathing in onsen, hot springs, showing how religious attitudes toward nudity can be highly context-dependent. One of the most striking examples comes from India's Jain tradition. The Digambara monks, who practice complete nudity, face unique challenges in modern society. How do they navigate public spaces? How do they interact with the secular legal system? The solutions vary by region and circumstance. In some areas, they're given special dispensation to appear nude in public. In others, they limit their movements to religious compounds. Some wear minimal clothing when traveling between religious sites, considering it a practical necessity rather than a religious violation. Modern Muslim communities face their own unique challenges in reconciling religious modesty requirements with contemporary life. The development of the burkini, full-body swimwear designed to meet Islamic modesty requirements, represents a creative solution to this challenge. However, its reception has varied dramatically across different Muslim communities and secular societies, highlighting the ongoing tension between religious ideals and practical realities. Perhaps most fascinating are the ways religious communities handle unexpected situations. What happens when medical necessity requires exposure of normally covered parts of the body? Most religions have developed detailed protocols for such situations. Islamic law, for instance, has specific provisions allowing opposite-gender medical treatment when necessary, demonstrating how religious rules can bend to accommodate practical needs without breaking. The rise of social media has created new challenges for religious communities dealing with nudity and modesty. Some Orthodox Jewish women have become social media influencers while maintaining modest dress requirements, creating new forms of fashion content that respect religious boundaries. Similarly, Muslim fashion bloggers have developed creative ways to demonstrate styles while maintaining hijab requirements, showing how religious practices can adapt to new media environments. Contemporary Christian naturist groups present perhaps the most direct challenge to conventional religious attitudes toward nudity. These groups argue that their practice returns to the original, pre-fall state of humanity, yet they must constantly negotiate with both religious and secular authorities about where and how they can practice their beliefs. Some have established private retreats while others work to educate their broader religious communities about their interpretation of biblical teachings on nudity. These real-world adaptations reveal something profound about how religion functions in human society. Rather than being rigid systems of rules, religions often demonstrate remarkable flexibility in practice, finding ways to maintain their core principles while adapting to practical realities. This adaptability has been crucial to their survival and continued relevance across changing times and cultures. 2. Ritual nakedness. The deliberate removal of clothing for religious purposes has been a powerful spiritual practice across cultures and centuries, often carrying meanings far more complex than modern observers might assume. From ancient mystery cults to contemporary Wiccan circles, ritual nudity serves purposes that range from symbolic rebirth to the dissolution of social barriers. The most well-documented historical example comes from early Christian baptismal practices. What many modern Christians don't realize is that for nearly 4 centuries, naked baptism was not just common, it was mandatory. The apostolic tradition of Hippolytus, written around 215 CE, provides detailed instructions. Let them stand in the water naked. Whether they be small children or young people or older people, either men or women. The ceremony was elaborate and deeply symbolic. Candidates would face west, naked, to renounce Satan, then turn east to accept Christ, their nakedness representing both the casting off of sin and return to humanity's original state of innocence. The logistics of these naked baptisms were surprisingly sophisticated. Churches built special baptistries with separate areas for men and women, heated pools for comfort, and carefully choreographed procedures to maintain modesty while preserving the symbolic power of ritual nudity. Female deacons assisted with women's baptisms, and elaborate screens and curtains were used to shield the newly baptized as they emerged from the water. Some baptistries even had underground passages so candidates could enter and exit without being seen by the general congregation. Less known but equally fascinating are the Jewish ritual baths called mikvah. While modern mikvahs maintain strict privacy, historical evidence suggests that in ancient times, these immersions sometimes took place in more public settings. The Dead Sea Scrolls describe communal immersion rituals where members of the Qumran community would purify themselves together. Even today, the requirement for absolute nudity in the mikvah is so strict that even bandages must be removed, something that has led to complex rabbinical discussions about how to handle medical devices or permanent makeup. The Greek mystery religions provide some of the most intriguing examples of ritual nudity. In the Eleusinian mysteries, initiates would reportedly strip naked and run through fields with torches, believing that this state of vulnerable exposure would help them commune with the gods. What's particularly interesting is how this practice influenced later religious traditions. Some scholars argue that early Christian baptismal practices were partially influenced by these mystery cult initiations. Turning to Eastern traditions, we find the remarkable practice of digambara, skyclad, among Jain monks. Unlike other forms of religious nudity that are temporary and ritual-specific, this is a permanent state. What's less known is the complex philosophy behind this practice. The Digambara monks' nudity isn't just about renunciation. It's based on the belief that clothing itself is a form of possession that can trap karma. They believe that complete nudity is necessary for the ultimate liberation of the soul. In Hinduism, the Naga sadhus present another fascinating case of permanent ritual nudity. These ash-covered holy men emerge from years of isolation to participate in the Kumbh Mela festival, where millions of pilgrims gather. What many don't realize is that becoming a Naga sadhu involves an elaborate death ritual where the initiate's old clothes are burned and their naked body is smeared with ash, symbolically destroying their old identity and marking their rebirth as a holy man. Contemporary pagan and Wiccan traditions have revived ritual nudity in modern contexts, often calling it skyclad practice. What's particularly interesting is how these groups have developed new justifications and meanings for ritual nudity. Some argue that it represents equality before the divine, others that it enhances magical power by removing barriers between the practitioner and natural energies. They've also developed modern protocols for handling practical concerns. Many groups have detailed guidelines for maintaining both safety and comfort during naked rituals, including options for partial coverage for those who need it. One of the most surprising aspects of ritual nudity is how it often transcends normal social boundaries. Historical records show that in many ritual contexts, nudity actually reduced rather than increased sexual tension. The naked body in a ritual context became desexualized, transformed into a symbol of spiritual rather than physical reality. This phenomenon has been documented across various cultures and time periods, suggesting something fundamental about how ritual context can transform the meaning of nudity. The use of ritual nudity as a transformative spiritual tool reveals fascinating insights into how religions understand the relationship between physical exposure and spiritual awakening. What makes this particularly intriguing is how the deliberate removal of clothing has been used across different traditions to facilitate profound spiritual experiences, often in ways that challenge our modern assumptions about modesty and spirituality. One of the most compelling examples comes from the medieval Christian mystical tradition. The 13th century Beguines, communities of lay religious women, developed what they called meditation in the manner of nakedness. What's remarkable about this practice is how it combined physical and spiritual nakedness. These women would literally strip naked in their private cells while contemplating what they called the naked truth of God. The renowned mystic Marguerite Porete wrote about this practice, describing how physical nakedness helped practitioners understand spiritual concepts of vulnerability and surrender. This connection between physical and spiritual nakedness appears in surprising places. In certain Sufi traditions, there are accounts of what's called the stripping of the spirit, tajrid ar-ruh, where some mystics would remove their clothes as a physical expression of removing worldly attachments. What's less known is that this practice was highly controversial even within Sufi circles, leading to fascinating theological debates about the relationship between external actions and internal spiritual states. The Native American sweat lodge ceremony provides another powerful example of transformative ritual nudity. While many people know about these ceremonies generally, what's less understood is the sophisticated spiritual philosophy behind the practice of entering the lodge naked or nearly so. The exposure of skin to heat and steam isn't just about physical purification. It's seen as creating a state of vulnerability that allows for spiritual transformation. Participants often report that the combination of physical exposure and intense heat creates a state of consciousness where normal social boundaries dissolve. Perhaps one of the most extreme examples comes from certain tantric traditions in both Hindu and Buddhist practice. The tradition of Chandali Yoga, or inner heat, practice, involves practitioners meditating naked in freezing temperatures. What makes this practice particularly fascinating is its goal. Practitioners believe that the extreme physical challenge of maintaining body heat while naked helps awaken subtle spiritual energies. There are documented cases of practitioners being able to dry wet sheets wrapped around their naked bodies in sub-zero temperatures through this practice. The modern neo-pagan movement has developed its own understanding of transformative ritual nudity. What's particularly interesting is how they've integrated contemporary psychological insights with ancient practices. Many groups speak of the skyclad state as creating what they call a hedge, a psychological boundary between sacred and mundane space. The act of removing clothes becomes a literal stripping away of social roles and everyday concerns. One lesser-known but fascinating example comes from certain Russian Orthodox practices of holy foolishness, or urodstvo. These holy fools would sometimes practice partial or complete nudity as part of their spiritual discipline, deliberately transgressing social norms to achieve spiritual insight. What's particularly interesting is how their communities often recognized their naked state as a sign of spiritual authority rather than scandal. Modern Christian naturist groups have developed sophisticated theological arguments for how nudity can facilitate spiritual growth. They point to research suggesting that controlled exposure to social nudity can increase body acceptance and reduce shame, qualities they see as spiritually beneficial. What's particularly interesting is how they connect this to traditional Christian themes of redemption and restoration to humanity's original state. The transformative power of ritual nudity often operates through what anthropologists call liminality, a state of being between normal social categories. Historical records show that many traditional societies used ritual nudity specifically because it created this liminal state. When people are naked together in a ritual context, normal social hierarchies often break down, creating opportunities for new insights and experiences. What makes these practices particularly relevant to contemporary discussions is how they challenge our assumptions about the relationship between nudity and sexuality. In most ritual contexts, nudity actually functions to desexualize the body rather than emphasize its sexual aspects. This paradox, that ritual nudity often reduces rather than increases sexual tension, has been documented across multiple cultures and traditions. These practices also raise interesting questions about the relationship between physical and spiritual vulnerability. Many traditions report that the physical vulnerability of nudity creates a corresponding spiritual openness. This suggests something fundamental about how humans experience spirituality through their bodies, challenging the mind-body dualism that often characterizes modern religious thought. The use of nudity as a form of religious protest and prophetic witness represents one of the most dramatic intersections of spirituality and social action. Throughout history, religious groups have used naked demonstration not just as a form of protest, but as a powerful spiritual statement about truth, authenticity, and divine message. The most fascinating historical example comes from 17th-century England, where Quaker activists developed what they called going naked as a sign. In 1652, a Quaker named Richard Robinson stripped naked and walked through the marketplace of Basingstoke, declaring God's judgment on the town. What many don't realize is that this wasn't an isolated incident. Over the next decade, dozens of Quakers performed similar naked witnesses across England and the American colonies. They carefully documented these acts, explaining them as divine commands similar to those given to the biblical prophet Isaiah, who walked naked for 3 years as a sign against Egypt and Ethiopia. The theological reasoning behind these naked protests was sophisticated. The Quakers saw nakedness as a powerful symbol of spiritual truth and authenticity, stripping away what they called the fig leaves of social convention and religious hypocrisy. What's particularly interesting is how they distinguished between nakedness and nudity. For them, nakedness represented spiritual truth, while nudity merely meant the absence of clothes. This distinction helped them justify their actions as spiritual rather than scandalous. Less well-known but equally fascinating are the Russian Doukhobors' naked protests in the early 20th century. The Sons of Freedom, a radical Doukhobor sect, would stage mass nude demonstrations to protest government policies. What made these protests unique was their combination of nudity with other religious symbols. They would often burn their clothes before marching naked, singing hymns and carrying religious banners. The burning of clothes symbolized their rejection of materialism and government authority, while their nakedness represented their return to spiritual truth. In India, the tradition of naked sadhus has long served as both spiritual practice and social protest. During the Indian independence movement, some naked holy men used their traditional status to challenge British authority. What's less known is how this merged spiritual and political protest. Their nakedness wasn't just about personal asceticism but became a powerful symbol of indigenous resistance to colonial rule. The British authorities found themselves in the awkward position of trying to regulate religious practices they couldn't fully understand or control. Modern examples include the Buddhist monks in Myanmar who in 2007 threatened to demonstrate naked if the military government continued its violent crackdown on protesters. This threat carried particular weight because of the deep cultural and religious significance of monks' robes in Buddhist society. The mere threat of naked protest was seen as a powerful spiritual statement, demonstrating how the symbolism of religious nudity can work even without actual naked demonstration. Contemporary Christian activists have also used naked protest in surprising ways. In 2012, members of a Christian environmental group staged a naked protest in the office of John Boehner, then Speaker of the House, to protest budget cuts. They cited the biblical prophet Micah's declaration that he would go stripped and naked as a sign of mourning. What makes this particularly interesting is how they connected ancient biblical traditions of prophetic nakedness to modern environmental concerns. The practice of naked protest often reveals complex interactions between religious and secular authority. Historical records show that authorities often struggled to respond to naked religious protesters. Treating them as ordinary criminals seemed inappropriate given their religious motivations, but allowing such protests could encourage others. This created fascinating legal and theological debates about the limits of religious expression and the nature of sacred protest. The effectiveness of naked religious protest often depends on its shock value in societies that associate nudity with shame or sexuality. What's particularly interesting is how religious protesters have used this association while simultaneously trying to transcend it. Their nakedness is meant to shock, but not in a sexual way. Instead, it's intended to shock people into reconsidering their spiritual and social assumptions. These practices also raise important questions about gender and religious authority. While male naked protesters often received some degree of tolerance as holy fools or prophets, female religious nudity was typically treated much more harshly. Yet there are remarkable examples of women using naked protest despite these additional barriers. Like the Nigerian women who in 2002 used the traditional threat of naked protest to challenge oil companies, combining indigenous spiritual traditions with modern political activism. 3. Art, religion and the nude form. The story of religious nude art represents one of history's most fascinating paradoxes: how institutions that often preached strict modesty became some of history's greatest patrons of nude artistic representation. This contradiction reveals deep truths about how religions have understood the relationship between the divine and the human body. The Vatican's relationship with nude art provides perhaps the most striking example of this complexity. Many people know about Michelangelo's nude figures in the Sistine Chapel, but few understand the theological debates that surrounded their creation. When Cardinal Carafa complained about the nudity in the Last Judgment, Michelangelo responded by painting him into hell with a snake wrapped around his body. What's less known is that Michelangelo defended his use of nudity on theological grounds, arguing that since God created humans in his image, the unclothed human form was the purest expression of divine creativity. The infamous fig leaf campaign of the Counter-Reformation period reveals how dramatically religious attitudes toward artistic nudity could shift. Pope Pius IV ordered the genitalia in Vatican artwork to be covered with fig leaves or drapery, leading to the bizarre situation where artists were hired specifically to modify masterpieces. What many don't realize is that this created a preservation nightmare. Some of these modifications actually damaged the original works, and modern conservators face difficult decisions about whether to remove these historical censorship attempts. Hindu temple art presents another fascinating case study. The explicit eroticism of temples like Khajuraho seems to contradict Hindu teachings about asceticism and spiritual transcendence. Yet these sculptures were created as part of a sophisticated theological program. The progression from explicit sexual imagery on the temple's exterior to increasingly abstract and spiritual representations as one moves inward was intended to guide the worshipper from physical to spiritual consciousness. This architectural program reveals a nuanced understanding of how physical beauty could serve spiritual purposes. Early Christian art shows surprising comfort with nudity that would later be considered scandalous. The earliest known representations of Christ's baptism show him completely naked, following the actual practice of the early church. What's particularly interesting is how these images became increasingly modest over time, reflecting changing attitudes toward nudity in Christian culture. By tracking these changes in artistic representation, historians can trace the evolution of Christian attitudes toward the body. Buddhist art presents its own fascinating paradoxes. While Buddhism generally advocates modesty, some of the earliest Buddhist art includes surprisingly sensual representations of the Buddha and other figures. The bare-chested Buddha images from Gandhara art reveal a fascinating fusion of Greek artistic traditions with Buddhist spiritual teachings. What's particularly interesting is how these representations helped make Buddhism more accessible to cultures with different attitudes toward the body. Islamic attitudes toward artistic representation of the human form are often misunderstood. While there are indeed restrictions on figurative art in many Islamic traditions, the reality is more complex than many realize. Persian miniatures, for instance, sometimes included nude figures in bathhouse scenes or mystical representations. The key was context. These images were meant for private contemplation rather than public display, revealing sophisticated distinctions between different types of artistic representation. Contemporary religious art continues to wrestle with these issues in new ways. When artist Harmonia Rosales created The Creation of God, a reimagining of Michelangelo's creation of Adam with black women as the central figures, it sparked intense debate about representation in religious art. What makes this particularly interesting is how it connects ancient questions about divine representation with modern concerns about race and gender in religious imagery. The controversy over Robert Mapplethorpe's religious photographs in the 1980s demonstrates how these ancient tensions continue to resonate. His black and white photographs of religious statues were simultaneously praised as deeply spiritual and condemned as blasphemous. What's particularly fascinating is how the same images could be seen as either sacred or profane depending on the viewer's perspective, revealing how context shapes our interpretation of religious nude art. The struggle between artistic expression and religious censorship has produced some of history's most dramatic cultural conflicts, revealing deep tensions between spiritual ideals and artistic freedom. What makes this particularly fascinating is how often these conflicts arise not just between religious and secular forces, but within religious communities themselves. One of the most compelling recent examples occurred in 2011 at the Cultural Center of the Philippines, where artist Midio Cruz's installation, Politismo, sparked a national crisis. The exhibition included religious symbols juxtaposed with naked figures, leading to violent protests and threats. What many don't know is that Cruz himself identified as Catholic and intended the work as a critique of religious commercialization rather than an attack on faith. The case became so heated that the Supreme Court of the Philippines had to weigh in, ultimately producing a landmark decision about the balance between religious sensitivity and artistic freedom. The Metropolitan Museum of Art's handling of religious nude art reveals the complex dance institutions must perform. In 2017, a petition demanding the removal of Balthus's dress dreaming, due to its suggestive depiction of a young girl, forced the museum to defend artistic freedom while acknowledging religious and moral concerns. What's particularly interesting is how the museum's response referenced historical religious art that could be considered equally controversial, including medieval depictions of the Christ child, demonstrating how context shapes perceptions of appropriate representation. Islamic art institutions face particularly complex challenges. The Sharjah Art Foundation in the United Arab Emirates made headlines when it fired its director over an installation deemed blasphemous for combining religious texts with images of nude mannequins. What few people realize is that this incident led to a fascinating internal debate within the Islamic art world about how to balance traditional religious values with contemporary artistic expression. Some Muslim artists and scholars argued that historical Islamic art had actually been more tolerant of figurative representation than many modern interpretations allow. The controversy over Chris O'Feely's The Holy Virgin Mary at the Brooklyn Museum in 1999 demonstrates how religious censorship attempts can backfire. Mayor Giuliani's effort to defund the museum over the painting's display generated massive publicity and attendance. What's less well-known is that O'Feely had incorporated traditional African religious imagery alongside Christian symbolism, raising complex questions about whose religious sensibilities deserve protection and respect. Modern social media platforms have become a new battleground for these conflicts. Facebook's notorious struggles with art censorship have led to absurd situations where famous religious masterpieces are removed for violating community standards. The case of Gustav Courbet's The Origin of the World, being repeatedly censored despite its presence in major museums, highlights how automated content moderation systems struggle with the nuanced distinctions between artistic and pornographic nudity. Religious museums and institutions often face internal struggles over these issues. The Vatican Museum's handling of their nude sculpture collection provides a fascinating case study. While some pieces remain fig-leafed from counter-Reformation censorship, others are displayed in their original state. The decision-making process about which modifications to maintain and which to reverse reveals complex negotiations between historical authenticity, religious sensitivity, and artistic integrity. Contemporary religious artists have developed innovative strategies for navigating these tensions. Some create works that can be displayed differently in secular and religious contexts, using removable elements or variable installation configurations. Others deliberately push boundaries to prompt discussion about religious attitudes toward the body. The rise of digital art has added new dimensions to these strategies, allowing artists to create works that can be modified for different audiences while preserving their essential message. The treatment of religious nude art in educational contexts presents particular challenges. Many religious schools and universities maintain art programs while serving communities with strict modesty standards. Their solutions range from segregated life drawing classes to the use of partially clothed models, revealing how institutions attempt to balance artistic training with religious values. What's particularly interesting is how these compromises often lead to innovative teaching methods that some secular institutions have subsequently adopted. Recent decades have seen the emergence of what might be called strategic nudity in religious art, works that deliberately use nude elements to comment on religious attitudes toward the body. Artists like René Cox, whose Yo Mama's Last Supper reimagined Leonardo's masterpiece with a nude female Christ, use nakedness not just as artistic expression but as theological commentary. These works force viewers to confront their assumptions about both religious imagery and the human body. The way different religious traditions choose to represent the human form in art reveals profound theological and cultural differences in how they understand the relationship between spirituality and embodiment. What's particularly fascinating is how these artistic traditions have evolved, adapted, and sometimes merged in unexpected ways. Christian artistic tradition presents perhaps the most complex relationship with the nude form, centered around the paradox of the Incarnation. The belief that God became human in Christ created a theological justification for depicting the human form, yet also generated endless debates about appropriate representation. The development of crucifixion imagery provides a fascinating case study. Early Christian art rarely showed a nude Christ, but by the Renaissance, the stripped Christ became a central image of Christian art. What many don't realize is that this shift reflected deep theological debates about the nature of Christ's humanity and suffering. The tradition of depicting nude saints reveals another layer of complexity. Saint Sebastian, repeatedly portrayed as a beautiful young man pierced by arrows, became an almost erotic figure in Renaissance art. What's less known is how artists justified these sensual depictions through the concept of holy beauty, arguing that physical beauty could reveal spiritual truth. Some artists even used models from Rome's red light districts to portray holy figures, leading to fascinating scandals when their models were recognized by viewers. Hindu art developed a remarkably sophisticated visual language for depicting the divine body. The concept of darshan, sacred seeing, led to careful attention to bodily proportions and poses in religious sculpture. What's particularly interesting is how Hindu artists developed specific mathematical ratios for divine bodies versus human ones. Temple sculptures often used different proportions for deities and devotees, creating a visual hierarchy that worshippers would subconsciously perceive. The development of Buddha images reveals a fascinating evolution in religious artistic representation. Early Buddhism avoided depicting the Buddha entirely, using empty thrones or footprints to indicate his presence. The emergence of Buddha statues represented a revolutionary shift, but one that carefully controlled how the human form could represent the divine. The 32 marks of the Buddha created specific rules for depiction, from the elongated earlobes to the bump on the head, transforming human features into symbols of spiritual attainment. Islamic artistic traditions developed sophisticated alternatives to figurative representation. While often described as simply prohibiting human figures, the reality is more complex. Persian miniature paintings, for instance, developed intricate conventions for depicting human forms while maintaining religious propriety. Figures might be shown with faces turned away or partially obscured by calligraphy. What's particularly interesting is how these limitations led to innovative artistic solutions that influenced global art history. The portrayal of female bodies in religious art presents particular complexities. The Virgin Mary's representation in Christian art shows fascinating variations across time and culture. While some traditions emphasized her modesty through heavy clothing, others, particularly in Renaissance Italy, showed her nursing the infant Jesus in intimate detail. What few people realize is that these breastfeeding Madonna images, known as Maria Lactans, were often based on ancient Egyptian images of Isis nursing Horus, revealing how religious artistic traditions could secretly preserve pagan imagery. Modern religious artists face unique challenges in representing the human form. Contemporary Jewish artists, for instance, must navigate between traditional restrictions on graven images and modern artistic expression. Some have developed fascinating solutions, like using abstract forms that suggest human presence without direct representation, or incorporating Hebrew letters into figure-like compositions. The representation of gender transformation in religious art provides some of the most interesting examples of how traditions handle the human form. Depictions of the Buddhist deity Avalokiteshvara, who appears in both male and female forms, show fascinating variations across Asian cultures. In China, The deity gradually transformed into the feminine Guanyin, while in Tibet, the male form remained dominant. These variations reveal how artistic representations can reflect and shape religious understanding of gender and embodiment. Contemporary religious art has begun exploring new questions about body representation. Some modern Christian artists are creating works addressing issues like disability theology, showing Christ with prosthetic limbs or medical devices. Islamic artists are using digital media to explore new ways of representing the human form that respect traditional restrictions while engaging contemporary audiences. Hindu artists are adapting traditional iconography to address modern social issues, creating powerful syntheses of ancient and contemporary concerns. 4. Religious movements embracing nudity. The emergence and evolution of Christian naturist movements represents one of the most fascinating intersections of modern spirituality and body acceptance. What makes this particularly interesting is how these groups use biblical interpretation and theological reasoning to argue that nudity isn't just permissible for Christians, it's potentially beneficial for spiritual growth. The modern Christian naturist movement traces its roots to the early 20th century. But what many don't know is that it gained significant momentum in the 1970s when several Protestant ministers began publicly advocating for what they called Christian nude recreation. Pope John Paul II's writings on the theology of the body, particularly his statement that the human body can remain nude and uncovered and preserve intact its splendor and its beauty, provided unexpected support from Catholic theology. This papal perspective helped legitimize Christian naturist arguments, though this wasn't the Pope's intended application. What makes Christian naturism particularly fascinating is its sophisticated theological framework. These groups argue that the traditional interpretation of the Genesis narrative has been fundamentally misunderstood. They point out that Adam and Eve were created naked and unashamed, and that shame about nudity came only after the fall. Therefore, they argue, body acceptance and comfort with nudity might actually be seen as a sign of redemption, a return to humanity's original, unfallen state. The movement has developed some surprisingly nuanced biblical scholarship. They point to various biblical examples of holy nudity that many traditional Christians overlook. David dancing naked before the Lord, Isaiah prophesying naked for 3 years, Peter fishing naked, and the early church's practice of naked baptism. What's particularly interesting is how they connect these examples to create a coherent theology of the body that challenges mainstream Christian assumptions about modesty. The practical application of these beliefs has led to some fascinating developments. Christian naturist camps and retreats have established elaborate protocols for maintaining what they call non-sexual social nudity. These communities often have stricter behavioral codes than secular nudist groups, reflecting their commitment to creating environments where nudity can be experienced as a spiritual rather than sexual state. What's particularly interesting is how they handle activities like communion and baptism. Some groups practice these sacraments in the nude, arguing this better reflects early church practice. The movement faces unique challenges in the modern world. How do they handle photography in an age of smartphones? How do they protect their communities from voyeurs while remaining open to genuine seekers? Some groups have developed sophisticated screening processes for new members, requiring letters of recommendation from pastors or established members. Others maintain strict policies about electronic devices and social media, creating spaces where members can practice their beliefs without fear of exposure. Perhaps most fascinating is how Christian naturist groups handle gender dynamics. Unlike some secular nudist communities that struggle with gender imbalance, Christian naturist groups often report more balanced participation between men and women. They attribute this to their theological framework, which emphasizes the family-oriented, non-sexual nature of their practice. Many groups require couples to attend together, and single participants often need additional references or waiting periods. The movement has also developed interesting approaches to raising children in naturist faith. They argue that children raised in body-positive Christian environments develop healthier attitudes towards sexuality and stronger resistance to pornography than those raised with body shame. What's particularly interesting is how they handle the transition from childhood innocence to adolescent awareness, developing age-appropriate education programs that combine Christian teaching with naturist philosophy. Contemporary Christian naturists have had to navigate complex relationships with mainstream churches. Some maintain dual memberships, attending conventional churches while privately practicing naturist beliefs. Others have formed their own congregations, though these remain rare. What's fascinating is how they handle scripture reading, prayer, and worship in naturist settings, developing new forms of religious practice that they argue better reflect biblical principles. The movement has also generated interesting theological discussions about the relationship between nudity and spirituality. Some practitioners report deeper prayer experiences when praying nude, citing a sense of literal and metaphorical nakedness before God. Others describe feeling closer to creation when experiencing nature without clothing barriers. These testimonies have led to sophisticated discussions about embodiment theology and the relationship between physical and spiritual experience. The history of religious movements that embraced nudity as a central practice reveals fascinating patterns of spiritual innovation, social protest, and religious persecution. What's particularly intriguing is how many of these movements developed surprisingly sophisticated theological justifications for their practices, often challenging mainstream religious authority in profound ways. The Adamites of the 2nd and 3rd centuries provide one of the earliest and most interesting examples. What many don't realize is that they weren't simply advocating nudity as a return to Eden. They developed a complex theology arguing that Christ's redemption had literally reversed the fall, making clothes not just unnecessary but potentially sinful. They conducted their religious services nude, believing this restored humanity to its pre-fall state. Their communities were structured around what they called paradise gatherings, where nudity was seen as a sign of spiritual enlightenment rather than sexual liberation. The medieval period saw several fascinating revivals of naked religious practice. The Brethren of the Free Spirit, emerging in the 13th century Netherlands, combined nudity with radical theological ideas about human perfection. What's particularly interesting is how they connected nudity to their belief in spiritual freedom from sin, arguing that those who achieved perfect union with God transcended normal moral rules and could therefore live without shame or clothing. This led to fascinating theological debates about the relationship between physical and spiritual freedom. The Taborites of 15th-century Bohemia present another compelling case. While often dismissed as simply radical reformers, their practice of ritual nudity was part of a sophisticated critique of both religious and social hierarchy. They believed that clothing represented social distinctions that should be eliminated in true Christian community. What's less known is how they connected this to economic justice, arguing that clothing represented private property, which they saw as contrary to Christian teaching. The Doukhobors nude protests in early 20th century Canada reveal how religious nudity could function as both spiritual practice and political resistance. What makes their case particularly fascinating is how they developed a theology of sacred nudity as witness. They saw naked demonstration not just as protest but as a form of prophecy, following biblical examples of naked prophets. Their practice of burning clothes before their nude protests added a powerful symbolic dimension, representing both spiritual purification and rejection of materialism. One of the most interesting but least understood movements was the Skoptsi sect in Imperial Russia. While primarily known for their practice of ritual castration, they also had complex beliefs about sacred nudity. They developed elaborate ceremonies where participants would gradually remove clothing as they achieved higher levels of spiritual enlightenment. What's particularly fascinating is how they connected this practice to their interpretation of Revelation, believing that the removal of clothing represented stages in the soul's preparation for Christ's return. The German Lebensreform movement of the late 19th century presents an interesting case of how religious nudity could merge with broader social reform movements. While not strictly religious, they developed what they called light air life philosophy that combined nudity with spiritual practices drawn from various traditions. What's particularly interesting is how they influenced both secular naturist movements and religious groups, creating a bridge between sacred and secular approaches to nudity. Modern scholarship has revealed fascinating connections between these historical movements. Many developed similar theological arguments independently, suggesting something fundamental about how religious groups understand the relationship between physical and spiritual nakedness. For example, multiple groups across different centuries connected nudity to the concept of spiritual truth, arguing that clothing represented various forms of falsehood or social pretense. The persecution these groups faced often revealed more about the societies around them than about their own practices. What's particularly interesting is how authorities struggled to categorize and respond to naked religious practice. Was it heresy, public indecency, political protest? The legal records of these cases provide fascinating insights into how societies grappled with the intersection of religious freedom and public morality. These historical movements continue to influence contemporary religious practice in surprising ways. Modern Christian naturist groups often reference these historical precedents, though they typically distance themselves from the more radical theological positions. What's fascinating is how they selectively adapt historical arguments while developing new theological frameworks more acceptable to contemporary religious sensibilities. The relationship between nudity and spirituality in Eastern religious traditions presents some of the most fascinating and enduring examples of how the naked body can serve as a vehicle for spiritual transformation. What makes these traditions particularly interesting is their ability to maintain ancient practices of sacred nudity even in the modern world, often with surprising adaptations and continued relevance. The Digambara Jain tradition provides perhaps the most striking example of institutionalized religious nudity still practiced today. What many don't realize is that the term Digambara literally means sky-clad or clothed in space. These monks don't simply practice nudity, they develop an elaborate philosophical justification for it. They argue that true spiritual liberation requires letting go of all possessions, including clothes, which they see as the most basic form of material attachment. What's particularly fascinating is how they've maintained this practice in modern India, developing complex protocols for interaction with secular society. The logistics of modern Digambara practice reveal fascinating adaptations. When these monks travel between temples or through cities, they're often accompanied by lay followers who help manage crowds and ensure appropriate behavior. What's less known is that they've developed elaborate hand signals and protocols for indicating when they need to move through public spaces, allowing them to maintain their vows while minimizing social disruption. Some monks carry peacock feather brushes to gently clear insects from their path, demonstrating how their nudity connects to broader principles of non-violence and respect for all life. The tradition of the Naga sadhus in Hinduism presents another compelling case. These ash-covered naked holy men emerge in massive numbers during the Kumbh Mela festival, but what many don't know is that their nudity follows strict spiritual protocols. The process of becoming a Naga sadhu involves elaborate initiation rites where the initiate's clothes are ceremonially burned along with their hair, symbolizing death to their old identity. What's particularly interesting is how they view ash covering as a form of spiritual clothing. They don't consider themselves truly naked but rather clothed in the sacred ash of cremation grounds. The Japanese tradition of shugendo, while not strictly a nude practice, includes fascinating elements of ritual exposure. During the harsh mountain ascetic practices called shugyo, practitioners sometimes engage in naked waterfall meditation or snow practices. What's particularly interesting is how they view this exposure not as nudity per se, but as a form of stripping away worldly attachments. The practice continues today, though often modified for modern sensibilities, with practitioners wearing minimal clothing rather than going completely nude. Buddhist traditions present some fascinating historical examples of naked practice, particularly in the Tantric traditions. The Mahasiddhas, or great adepts, of medieval India often practiced what they called natural awareness, while naked, believing that physical nudity could facilitate spiritual awakening. What's less known is how these practices influenced the development of Tibetan Buddhism, where certain advanced yogic practices still involve degrees of nudity, though usually practiced in strict secrecy. The relationship between nudity and power in Eastern traditions reveals interesting patterns. Many of these traditions associate naked practice with spiritual authority rather than shame. The naked yogi or sadhu is often seen as having transcended normal social constraints, demonstrating spiritual achievement through their indifference to conventional modesty. What's particularly fascinating is how this authority often extends beyond religious contexts. Naked holy men have historically been able to challenge political authorities in ways that clothed individuals could not. Modern adaptations of these traditions show interesting developments. Some contemporary yoga schools have developed what they call naked yoga practices, attempting to connect to these ancient traditions while adapting them for modern Western audiences. What's particularly interesting is how they navigate the complex issues of gender, sexuality, and cultural appropriation while trying to maintain some connection to traditional spiritual principles. The role of gender in these traditions reveals complex patterns. While many ancient texts speak of both male and female practitioners engaging in naked practices, historical reality has often been more restricted. What's fascinating is how modern female practitioners are reclaiming and reinterpreting these traditions, sometimes leading to significant controversy within traditional communities. The emergence of new religious movements in the 20th and 21st centuries has brought fresh interpretations to the relationship between spirituality and nudity, often blending ancient practices with contemporary psychology and social theory. What makes these movements particularly fascinating is their ability to create new spiritual frameworks that resonate with modern seekers while maintaining connections to traditional sacred practices. The Raelian movement presents one of the most interesting modern approaches to religious nudity. Founded in the 1970s, this UFO religion promotes what they call sensual meditation, and has developed sophisticated arguments for body acceptance. What many don't realize is that their practices aren't simply about personal freedom. They've developed a complex theology arguing that human sexuality and nudity are gifts from extraterrestrial creators that should be celebrated rather than suppressed. Their annual, Go Topless, protests are actually religious demonstrations, based on their belief in gender equality as a cosmic principle. Contemporary Wiccan and neo-pagan traditions have developed particularly nuanced approaches to ritual nudity. The practice of working, skyclad, naked, in ritual settings involves elaborate protocols that many outside the tradition don't understand. What's fascinating is how these groups handle practical issues of consent and comfort. Many covens have developed sophisticated systems allowing participants to choose their level of ritual nudity while maintaining the symbolic power of the practice. Some groups use special robes that can be partially opened for specific ritual moments, creating a middle ground between full nudity and complete coverage. The Human Awareness Institute, while not strictly religious, has developed interesting spiritual approaches to nudity through their workshops and retreats. What's particularly interesting is how they combine elements from various religious traditions with modern psychological insights about body image and shame. Their programs often include carefully structured experiences of non-sexual nudity as part of broader spiritual development work. What's less known is how they've influenced other religious groups' approaches to sacred nudity, providing practical models for handling issues of safety and consent. The Burning Man Festival, while not explicitly religious, has become a fascinating laboratory for experimental approaches to spiritual nudity. What many don't realize is that numerous religious and spiritual groups use the festival's accepting atmosphere to explore sacred nude practices. Some groups conduct dawn meditation sessions or sunset ceremonies where nudity is seen as a way to connect with natural cycles and elements. What's particularly interesting is how these practices often blend multiple religious traditions with contemporary environmental spirituality. Modern tantric movements have developed unique approaches to sacred nudity that often differ significantly from traditional tantra. What's fascinating is how they've adapted ancient practices for contemporary Western audiences while trying to maintain spiritual authenticity. Some groups have developed elaborate protocols for conscious nudity, practices that combine meditation, breath work, and careful attention to boundaries. What's less understood is how these groups navigate the complex territory between spiritual practice and sensual experience, often developing sophisticated theoretical frameworks to distinguish their practices from both conventional religion and secular sexuality. The rise of eco-spiritual movements has brought new interpretations of sacred nudity focused on environmental connection. Groups like the Tribe of Pan combine naturist practices with earth-based spirituality, arguing that naked contact with nature can facilitate deeper ecological awareness. What's particularly interesting is how they've developed seasonal ceremonies where nudity plays different ritual roles depending on natural cycles. Some groups practice what they call forest bathing, meditative naked walks in nature that they see as both spiritually and physically healing. Body-positive spirituality movements have emerged that make sacred nudity central to their practice of healing religious trauma. What makes these groups particularly fascinating is how they explicitly work to counter negative religious messages about the body through ritual nudity practices. Some have developed ceremonies specifically designed to heal body shame, often incorporating elements from psychology and trauma therapy alongside spiritual practices. The influence of social media and digital technology has led to interesting adaptations in how these movements practice and promote their beliefs. Some groups have developed online ritual spaces where participants can experience forms of virtual sacred nudity, raising fascinating questions about embodiment and spiritual practice in digital contexts. What's particularly interesting is how they navigate platform content restrictions while trying to maintain authentic spiritual expression. 5. Gender, power, and religious modesty. The intersection of gender, religious authority, and nudity reveals some of history's most fascinating power dynamics, often exposing deep contradictions in how different faiths approach male and female bodies. What makes this particularly compelling is how these dynamics continue to shape contemporary religious debates about modesty, authority, and spiritual leadership. The story of naked female mystics presents one of history's most intriguing challenges to religious authority. Take the remarkable case of the medieval mystic Margaret of Cortona, who shocked her community by stripping naked in church to demonstrate her complete surrender to God. What many don't know is that her act was part of a larger tradition of female mystics who used nudity to claim spiritual authority in a male-dominated church. These women turned their naked vulnerability into a source of power, arguing that their willingness to be physically exposed demonstrated their spiritual purity. The double standards in religious nudity taboos reveal fascinating power dynamics. In many traditions, male religious figures could practice forms of ritual nudity that were strictly forbidden to women. The naked Hindu sadhus provide a striking example. While male holy men could practice complete nudity, female sadhvis, holy women, were expected to maintain strict modesty. What's particularly interesting is how some women challenge these restrictions. Historical records show cases of female ascetics in India who claimed the right to practice naked, often facing severe persecution but sometimes gaining followers who saw their defiance as a sign of spiritual power. Modern religious movements have had to grapple with these gender dynamics in new ways. Christian naturist groups face particular challenges in this regard. What's fascinating is how they've developed theological arguments for gender equality in religious nudity, often citing Eve's original equality with Adam in Eden. However, practical implementation reveals ongoing tensions. Some groups maintain strict policies about mixed-gender activities, while others argue that such restrictions perpetuate unhealthy attitudes about bodies and sexuality. The role of female religious leadership in nude rituals presents particularly complex challenges. In Wiccan traditions, the high priestess often leads skyclad rituals, claiming a form of spiritual authority through ritual nudity that was historically denied to women in mainstream religions. What's less known is how these practices have influenced other contemporary religious movements. Some feminist spiritual groups have developed their own rituals of sacred nudity specifically designed to challenge traditional religious power structures. The policing of female religious dress reveals fascinating contradictions. In many traditions, male religious authorities create and enforce rules about female modesty while claiming the right to view and judge female bodies. What's particularly interesting is how some women have turned these dynamics back on themselves. There are documented cases of women using the threat of exposure to challenge religious authority, like the Nigerian women who threatened naked protest against their religious leaders, knowing that seeing their nudity would be considered a spiritual curse. Religious dress codes often reveal complex intersections of gender and power. In some traditions, more restrictive clothing requirements for women are justified as protecting them from male desire. What's fascinating is how some female religious leaders have challenged this logic. Some Muslim feminist scholars, for example, argue that the Quran's modesty requirements were originally more equal between genders and that current interpretations reflect cultural patriarchy rather than divine intent. The regulation of female bodies in religious spaces shows interesting historical patterns. Many traditions developed elaborate rules about when and how women's bodies could be exposed, even in same-gender contexts like ritual baths or childbirth. What's particularly interesting is how women sometimes used these spaces to develop their own forms of spiritual authority. The female attendants at Jewish ritual baths, for instance, often became important spiritual advisors to women in their communities, creating a parallel structure of religious authority. Contemporary feminist religious movements have developed fascinating approaches to sacred nudity. Some groups practice what they call embodied theology, using ritual nudity to challenge traditional religious ideas about female bodies. What's particularly interesting is how they combine ancient practices with modern feminist theory, creating new forms of religious expression that claim spiritual power through bodily liberation. The impact of social media and digital technology on these dynamics reveals new complexities. Religious women using platforms like Instagram to discuss modesty and body image often face harassment and censorship, while male religious authorities freely share their views on female dress. What's fascinating is how some women are using these same platforms to challenge traditional power structures, creating online communities that support alternative interpretations of religious modesty requirements. The complex relationship between religious modesty requirements and modern life reveals fascinating adaptations and continuing tensions, particularly in how different faiths navigate changing social norms while maintaining traditional values. What makes this especially interesting is how these adaptations often reflect deeper struggles within religious communities about authority, interpretation, and cultural relevance. The evolution of Muslim swimwear provides one of the most fascinating examples of modern religious adaptation. The development of the burkini in 2004 represents more than just a practical solution to modesty requirements. It reveals how religious communities actively negotiate between tradition and modern life. What many don't realize is that the burkini sparked intense theological debates within Muslim communities. Some scholars argued it perfectly fulfilled religious requirements while enabling participation in modern life, while others contended it represented an unacceptable compromise. The controversy reveals deeper questions about how religious modesty should be interpreted in contemporary contexts. Orthodox Jewish communities have developed particularly innovative solutions to modern modesty challenges. The creation of specialized swimwear for women, custom wigs, shadels that look increasingly natural, and modest yet fashionable clothing lines all demonstrate creative approaches to maintaining religious standards while engaging with modern culture. What's particularly fascinating is how these innovations have led to new religious discussions. For instance, debates about whether a wig that looks too natural might defeat the purpose of hair covering, or if form-fitting modest clothing really meets the spirit of TZNIUT, modesty laws. The rise of modest fashion influencers on social media presents another interesting phenomenon. What many don't realize is that these influencers often navigate complex religious politics. A Muslim fashion blogger, for instance, might face criticism for making hijab too fashionable, while simultaneously being praised for making modest dress appealing to young women. Some Orthodox Jewish influencers have faced similar challenges, with rabbinical authorities questioning whether their interpretation of modest fashion truly meets religious standards. Religious athletic wear represents another fascinating area of adaptation. The development of sports hijabs, modest swimsuits, and specialized athletic wear for religious women has enabled greater participation in sports and fitness activities. What's particularly interesting is how these developments have challenged traditional religious interpretations of gender roles. Some conservative religious authorities initially opposed women's sports participation entirely, but the availability of modest athletic wear has helped shift these attitudes. The workplace presents unique challenges for religious modesty requirements. Some Orthodox Jewish women have developed creative solutions for maintaining modest dress in professional environments, like wearing neutral-colored shells under business attire or using specialized hosiery that meets both professional and religious standards. What's fascinating is how these adaptations often involve detailed rabbinical consultations about specific fabrics, cuts, and combinations of clothing. Modern reproductive health care has forced interesting adaptations in religious modesty practices. Some hospitals have developed specialized protocols for ultra-Orthodox Jewish or Muslim women requiring medical examination while maintaining modesty requirements. What's less known is how these adaptations have sometimes influenced broader medical practice. For instance, some hospitals have adopted more modest examination procedures for all patients after seeing the benefits of these protocols. The emergence of modest fashion weeks in various global cities reveals interesting tensions between commercialization and religious values. What's particularly fascinating is how these events have become sites of inter-religious dialogue, with Muslim, Jewish, and Christian designers often sharing perspectives on modest fashion. These events have also sparked important discussions about whether the commercialization of religious modesty represents a corruption of spiritual values or a necessary adaptation to modern life. Religious modesty in performance arts has led to creative solutions. Some Orthodox Jewish women's theater groups have developed all-female productions where they can perform without modesty constraints, while maintaining strict gender separation in the audience. Similar adaptations can be found in some Muslim communities. What's particularly interesting is how these separate spaces have sometimes become sites of religious innovation, where women can explore religious themes more freely than in mixed-gender settings. The impact of virtual reality and online spaces on religious modesty presents new challenges. Some religious authorities have begun issuing guidelines about avatar modesty in virtual environments, raising fascinating questions about how traditional modesty requirements apply to digital representation. What's particularly interesting is how some religious communities are using these new technologies to create safe spaces for discussing modesty issues that might be too sensitive for face-to-face conversation. The relationship between women's spiritual experiences and religious attitudes toward the body reveals some of history's most profound tensions between institutional power and personal devotion. What makes this particularly fascinating is how women have often found ways to transform restrictive body politics into unique forms of spiritual expression and authority. The story of medieval female mystics provides one of history's most compelling examples of this transformation. Women like Marguerite Perret and Julian of Norwich used vivid bodily metaphors in their spiritual writings, often describing intensely physical experiences of divine love. What many don't realize is that these women were often turning the very restrictions placed on their bodies into sources of spiritual insight. Unable to access formal religious education or hold church offices, they claimed authority through direct bodily experiences of the divine that male religious authorities couldn't easily dismiss. The phenomenon of holy anorexia among medieval female saints reveals darker aspects of this relationship. Women like Catherine of Siena used extreme fasting as a form of spiritual practice, often justifying it through religious visions and experiences. What's particularly fascinating is how these practices represented both internalization of and resistance to religious attitudes about female bodies. These women were simultaneously conforming to ideals of female self-denial while claiming extraordinary spiritual authority through their bodily practices. Modern women's spirituality movements have developed interesting new approaches to these historical patterns. Some feminist religious groups have created rituals specifically celebrating female bodies and biological processes that traditional religions often treat as sources of impurity. What's particularly interesting is how they often draw on ancient religious practices while reinterpreting them through modern feminist perspectives. For instance, some groups have revived ancient menstrual rituals but transformed them from practices of separation and purification into celebrations of female power and creativity. The role of women's religious bathing traditions reveals fascinating patterns of female spiritual authority. In Jewish communities, the mikveh attendant, balanet, often became an important spiritual advisor to women, particularly regarding intimate matters that couldn't be discussed with male rabbis. What's less known is how these women sometimes developed their own bodies of practical religious knowledge that existed parallel to, but separate from, male religious authority. Contemporary Muslim women's fitness movements present interesting adaptations of religious modesty requirements. The rise of women-only gyms and exercise classes in Muslim communities shows how women are creating new spaces for physical activity while maintaining religious standards. What's particularly fascinating is how these spaces often become sites of spiritual discussion and female religious authority, where women can freely discuss both physical and spiritual matters. The emergence of embodied theology in feminist religious movements represents a direct challenge to traditional religious attitudes about female bodies. These movements explicitly celebrate physical experiences, including sexuality, menstruation, childbirth, and aging, as sources of spiritual wisdom. What's particularly interesting is how they often draw on traditional religious texts and practices but interpret them in radically different ways, finding support for body-positive spirituality in the same sources traditionally used to justify body shame. Religious dress reforms led by women reveal complex patterns of resistance and adaptation. The decision of some Muslim women to reclaim the hijab as a feminist choice, or Orthodox Jewish women creating fashion lines that meet both religious and professional standards, shows how women actively negotiate religious requirements rather than simply accepting them passively. What's fascinating is how these adaptations often lead to new interpretations of religious texts and traditions. The role of women's bodies in religious protest movements presents particularly interesting cases. When Iranian women remove their hijabs in protest, or when Orthodox Jewish women pray at the Western Wall wearing traditionally male prayer items, they're using their bodies as sites of religious and political resistance. What's particularly powerful about these protests is how they often use traditional religious symbols and practices in new ways that challenge religious authority. Modern female religious leaders have developed fascinating approaches to teaching about bodies and spirituality. Some women rabbis, ministers, and religious teachers have created new ceremonies and educational programs that directly address bodies, sexuality, and gender in ways traditional religious education often avoided. What's particularly interesting is how they often ground these innovations in traditional religious texts and practices, finding precedent for more positive approaches to bodies and gender. The emergence of movements directly challenging traditional religious attitudes toward bodies and gender represents one of the most dynamic aspects of contemporary spiritual life. What makes this particularly fascinating is how these challenges often come from within religious traditions themselves, creating complex dialogues between tradition and innovation. The Muslim feminist movement Musawa provides one of the most interesting examples of this challenge. What many don't realize is that these scholars aren't rejecting Islamic tradition but rather reinterpreting it through detailed theological and historical analysis. They argue that many current restrictions on women's bodies reflect cultural patriarchy rather than authentic religious requirements. Their research into early Islamic history has revealed fascinating evidence that women in early Muslim communities had much more freedom in dress and public participation than commonly assumed. The recent Women of the Wall movement in Jerusalem presents another compelling case of religious body politics in action. These women's decision to wear prayer shawls and read from the Torah at the Western Wall isn't simply about equal rights. It represents a fundamental challenge to traditional interpretations of religious gender roles. What's particularly fascinating is how they use traditional Jewish legal arguments to support their positions, often knowing more about religious law than their opponents. The emergence of feminist theology in Christian traditions has led to remarkable re-examinations of traditional teachings about bodies and gender. What's particularly interesting is how some theologians have begun recovering and highlighting historical examples of more body-positive Christian teachings. They've uncovered fascinating evidence of early Christian communities that had more egalitarian attitudes toward gender and bodies, using these findings to challenge current conservative positions. The rise of LGBTQ+ religious movements presents particularly complex challenges to traditional religious body politics. Organizations like Dignity, Catholic, and Keshet, Jewish, aren't just arguing for acceptance, they're developing new theological frameworks for understanding gender and embodiment. What's fascinating is how they often draw on mystical and alternative traditions within their religions that offer more fluid understandings of gender and bodies than mainstream interpretations. Modern pagan and goddess movements have developed particularly radical challenges to traditional religious body politics. What makes their approach interesting is how they often combine ancient religious practices with contemporary feminist theory. Some groups have created entirely new rituals celebrating aspects of female embodiment that traditional religions often treat as sources of impurity. What's particularly fascinating is how they've influenced more mainstream religious discussions about gender and bodies. The development of religious sex-positive movements represents another interesting challenge to traditional attitudes. Groups like the Religious Institute aren't just arguing against body shame. They're developing new theological frameworks for understanding sexuality as sacred. What's particularly interesting is how they often ground their arguments in traditional religious texts and concepts, finding support for body-positive attitudes in unexpected places. Religious women's health movements have emerged as another important site of challenge to traditional body politics. Some Muslim women doctors have developed new interpretations of modesty requirements that prioritize women's health needs, while Orthodox Jewish women's health advocates have created resources helping women navigate religious requirements while receiving proper medical care. What's fascinating is how these movements often successfully challenge religious authorities by focusing on practical necessity rather than theoretical arguments. Digital activism has created new opportunities for challenging religious body politics. Social media platforms have enabled religious women to share experiences and challenge traditional interpretations in ways previously impossible. What's particularly interesting is how these online discussions often lead to real-world changes in religious communities, as women discover they're not alone in questioning traditional attitudes. The rise of religious body-positive influencers represents another fascinating development. These individuals often walk a delicate line between respecting religious traditions and challenging harmful body attitudes. What's particularly interesting is how they're creating new languages for discussing bodies and spirituality, often combining religious terminology with contemporary psychological insights about body image and shame. These movements collectively represent a fundamental shift in how religious communities approach questions of gender, bodies, and power. What's particularly fascinating is how they're often most successful when they work within religious traditions rather than simply rejecting them, finding ways to honor religious heritage while promoting more equitable and body-positive approaches to spirituality. The complex relationship between religion and nudity reveals fundamental truths about human spirituality and our eternal struggle to reconcile our physical and spiritual natures. Through our exploration of various traditions, movements, and practices, we've seen how attitudes toward the naked human form often reflect deeper theological and philosophical understanding about humanity's relationship with the divine. What emerges from this examination is not a simple story of repression versus liberation, but rather a rich tapestry of how different cultures and traditions have tried to make sense of human embodiment. From the early Christian practice of nude baptism to contemporary religious naturist movements, from ascetic naked holy men to feminist spiritual protests, we see how the unclothed human form has served as a powerful symbol of both spiritual purity and human frailty. The contemporary relevance of these issues cannot be overstated. As our society grapples with questions of body shame, gender equality, and religious freedom, understanding these historical and theological perspectives becomes increasingly important. Modern debates about religious dress codes, modest fashion, and gender roles in religious institutions all connect back to these fundamental questions about the relationship between spirituality and embodiment. Looking forward, these insights suggest that religious attitudes toward the body will continue to evolve as communities face new challenges and opportunities. The rise of digital technology, changing social norms, and emerging spiritual movements all promise to further complicate and enrich this ongoing dialogue between the sacred and the corporeal. I invite you to share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. How do these historical and contemporary perspectives on religious nudity relate to your own spiritual journey? What role do you think religious attitudes toward the body will play in shaping future spiritual practices? If you found this exploration enlightening, please consider subscribing to our channel for more in-depth discussions of religious and cultural history. Your engagement helps us continue producing thoughtful content about the complex intersections of spirituality, culture, and human experience. Remember, understanding our past helps us navigate our present and shape our future. Thank you for joining me on this fascinating journey through the complex world of religion and nudity.